And this is Kim Hutchinson. I'm the Executive Director of the Virginia Farmers Market Association, and I am thrilled to kick off our last in our very successful Lunch and Learn webinar series, co-hosted by the Virginia Cooperative Extension. It has been a thrill to have Sarah and Rachel with us every week for the past 6 weeks or 8 weeks, putting together sessions that focus on issues that are pertinent to farmers market managers and to farmers, producers, vendors in the Virginia area. Today's topic is an introduction to fresh produce for safety, and it is with great pleasure that we start this session. I will remind you one last time that the Virginia Farmers Market Association is a statewide association that works with Virginia's 356 plus farmers markets around the state of Virginia, and our focus is to make sure that the farmers markets are sustainable, that you have the tools and resources necessary in order to continue to be vibrant, viable businesses here in the state of Virginia. As part of that, we do a tremendous amount of training, such as this Lunch and Learn webinar series. We do in-person vendor trainings, etc. And once a year, we host our annual conference. This year, it is November 13th, 14th, and 15th in Stanton, Virginia at the Stonewall Jackson Hotel, where we will have multiple sessions and multiple tracks for beginners and experience for farmers, producers, vendors, as well as market managers, covering a wide range of topics that will focus on everything from how to be successful as a vendor to agritourism and how you can generate new business lines by utilizing agritourism here in Virginia. So I hope to see you all. Please give us your feedback on this Lunch and Learn series because we'd like to continue to bring you these series. And at this time, I'm going to turn the session over to Sarah Sharp to get started. Sarah?
Great, thanks, Kim. So I am Sarah Sharp, and I am the Agriculture Extension Agent over in Greene County, which is the county just north of Charlottesville. And I am going to talk today about fresh produce food safety. And this is something that, having grown up going to farmers markets and now as an extension agent, is something that I feel incredibly passionate about because I think it's something that we all need to be looking at and thinking about and making sure that we are doing all that we can to keep our customers safe. So first off, if it'll work, there we go. I'm going to do just a basic, I've got just a couple slides on the Produce Safety Rule and the Food Safety Modernization Act. And this is something that hopefully everyone has heard of so far, but I like to just kind of keep it around, make sure people are still thinking about it, because as you grow as a vendor, this may be something that may not be applicable to you right now, but it may be applicable to you a few years down the road. So the Produce Safety Rule and FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, is the most sweeping reform of our food safety laws in more than 70 plus years. And this doesn't just apply to produce, it applies to 7 different categories. But the one that we're going to focus on, obviously, is the Produce Safety Rule. And the whole goal of FSMA is to try to switch where instead of responding to contamination outbreaks, that we're doing a better job of trying to prevent these outbreaks. And many of the rules require a food safety training to fulfill compliance. So for example, if you do fall under the Produce Safety Rule, which we'll talk about, it is required that you attend one. It's an 8-hour training. And as of right now, that one training is good forever for you to fulfill that requirement. So we start thinking about a risk-based approach that's going to look at those high-risk practices, not necessarily those high-risk commodities. So this does allow for some different practices because it recognizes that all farms are not the same. It recognizes that there are further processes and rarely consumed raw, and that we do have kill steps. For example, if you're growing tomatoes that are going into paste or juice, you may not fall under this. Not all water or soil amendments are the same, and there are no requirements for uncontrollable factors such as wildlife getting into your fields. So this is if you are familiar with GAPS or good agriculture practices, it is similar to GAPS, but not exactly the same. So there are some differences. So this is what everybody wants to know. Do I fall under the produce safety rule? So you are exempt from the produce safety rule if you have less than 25,000 total in produce sales per year, averaged over 3 years. If the commodity is if you only grow one thing, so if you only grow potatoes, that is an exempt produce, and so you would not fall under the produce safety rule. If it's going for processing, or if the produce is grown for your own personal consumption, and if you are selling at the farmer's market, then that doesn't apply to you. If you are qualified exempt, and just so you know, I am going through this very quickly because this is an 8-hour training to go through this. There will be some resources to help you determine if you think you may be on the verge of this. When I send out the follow-up email with the folder of resources, it will have a wonderful resource that helps walk you through all of these steps to help you determine where you are under the produce safety rule. So if it is qualified exempt, you will have to do some labeling. Basically, you will have to display the name and a complete business address of the farm where the produce was grown. If you have some sort of label, so you are doing some sort of value-added product, it will have to be on that package, which if you were in on my labeling talk last week, that has to be on there anyway. Or it can be on a poster or a sign where that produce is sold. So you could have a banner up in your farmer's market booth that had the farm name as well as the address. As I also said last week, there is still out. We're still waiting on a response from the FDA about what to do if you are, selling at your booth, if you're selling from multiple different farms, the best way to handle that. So if that is you may want to be in touch with me or someone else on our fresh produce food safety team to help you figure out exactly where and what you may need to do with that. There is compliance, so it is required that as of January 20th of 2020, which is 3 months from now, that if you will need to do this. Now, I give kind of just a little side note that goes along with this, because at the farmer's market, this is something that we could do just for a good vendor practice as well. We want to make sure that we have good visibility and good signage so that our customers are able to find us. So having a banner, you can get them really, they're not really expensive. You can get one made with the farm name and the address, and that checks off that visibility box as well as this box to meet this requirement as well. You do have to keep some records if you're qualified exempt, just to basically demonstrate that your farm is below that sales threshold, you're selling to more qualified end users, and that the purchaser is a qualified end user. So that's somebody, so if you are selling at the farmer's market directly to that consumer, that's a qualified end user. If you are selling to a restaurant, that's a qualified end user. If you are selling wholesale, that's then going to go somewhere else, that is not a qualified end user. Again, if you think you may fall under this and you have a lot of questions, feel free to get in touch with us. You should have keeping records as of January 26th of 2016. So you will want to go ahead and keep those records if you need to. And you have to keep a written record that just reflects an annual review and basically verification that says that you are within over 25,000 but under the 250,000 or 500,000 limit threshold. So, getting away from the produce safety rule, again, if you have questions, feel free to reach out. That's just kind of a basic general overview to get you to start thinking about it and make sure that you've at least heard about the produce safety rule. And now I'm going to switch more over into produce safety, because this is something that applies to all produce growers, whether you're just selling at one small farmer's market, or if you have 20 acres of produce and you're selling at 10 different farmers markets. This is something that all of us need to really be thinking about. And this is so important because more and more consumers are looking to these local farmers and farmers markets as sources for their food. And they make that assumption that their local food is safe. So this is where I get really passionate, because it is our job. If they think that we are providing safe food, it's our job to make sure that we are providing safe food and that we are keeping them safe. You know, think about those romaine lettuce scares. People were afraid to buy romaine lettuce from the grocery store, and romaine lettuce was pulled off the shelves. And so they think that and assume that all of our romaine lettuce that we may be selling is going to be safe for them to eat. So when you think about it, that's a pretty big responsibility that we shoulder, making sure that we're keeping this food that people are afraid to buy at the grocery store, that we're keeping it safe for them to eat. So going through this, just making sure that, you know, they think that the produce is much fresher. We know that. We can go in the grocery store and look and see that it may have been 3 or 4 weeks before, when that romaine lettuce was harvested, before it made it to the grocery store. Whereas we can provide it within, 5 days, 7 days, less than that sometimes, maybe a day, that we've had it out of the field and can have it on that consumer's table. Getting to meet and talk to the farmer who produced the food. And that's so important. The whole know your farmer, know your food movement. Having less of a carbon footprint. So not buying produce that's traveled all the way from Arizona or Mexico, you know, having such that produce that travels much less miles. And having safe food. Again, that's what they think of when they think of buying local, is that they're buying a safe product. So the thing is, in order for that produce to be safe, it must be kept safe from the farm all the way to the market. And there are many things that can affect the safety of that produce and could be a liability issue for you on your farm. So what I'm going to talk about is how do we mitigate or manage some of that risk and liability, and just kind of think through some of the basics. So this presentation is just going to think through, or help you start thinking through, just some little changes that you may be able to make on your farm that will help your produce and your products be safer for those consumers that you're feeding. So foodborne illness, really, you know, this data is a little old. And I know I did pull these slides from the Enhancing the Safety of Locally Grown Produce presentation, and I know they're working on updating it, but even in 2011, we think that every year 1 out of every 6 Americans has some sort of foodborne illness. 128,000 hospitalizations and 3,000 deaths, and those are just the ones that are reported. We know that there are more that just don't get reported because somebody has stomach problems for 3 days, they assume it's just a bug, and they don't even think about going to the hospital or going to the health department and reporting it. So that number is more than likely higher. We just don't have the data to prove it. So what is a foodborne illness and why are we concerned about it? So this is any disease caused by any food that you may eat, such as, and we hear about these on the news, Salmonella, Listeria, E. coli 0157H7, Yersinia, norovirus, Cryptosporidium, Cyclospora, Toxoplasma, and then we have parasitic protozoans like Giardia that we have to think about as well. And we know that, you know, when we look at Salmonella, Listeria, and E. coli 0157H7, those are the ones that we hear about on the news on a regular basis when we think about our produce food safety or produce outbreaks. So going into, and this again is a little bit of old data, but still it really illustrates that bigger picture that even from 1996 to 2007, there were 72 reported outbreaks of foodborne illness associated with 20 fresh produce commodities. And this is both domestic and imported. So we can't, obviously, we can't just assume that anything grown in the US is safe and anything imported is not. It goes both ways. 13 outbreaks associated with tomatoes, 11 with melons, and 24 with leafy greens, such as lettuce and spinach. And we think about here, our highest risk produce that we really have to think about are lettuce, juices, sprouts, berries, green onions, and nuts. And that's where we have our highest likelihood of something going wrong or happening. The problem when we think about this is once produce is contaminated, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible sometimes, to remove contamination. And there are whole classes that I've taken on some of this food safety and why some of these things happen. Basically, so plants have opening on their leaves to allow for that carbon dioxide oxygen exchange. If there's contaminated water on the leaf, that water can enter into these openings. So therefore, that contamination may not just be on the surface, it can also be inside the plant. So one example that is used a lot in the food safety world is thinking about cantaloupes. So there was a listeria outbreak in cantaloupes. And so we think, well, cantaloupes, we don't eat the outside rind, we only eat the inside. Well, yeah, so when you think about that stem scar on that cantaloupe, basically what happened was that cantaloupe was washed after it was harvested. There was listeria in the water that the cantaloupe was washed in, and there was a temperature difference, and which again, science, and so then water ended up getting pulled into that cantaloupe through the stem scar. So listeria was actually found within the cantaloupe, not just on the outside surface. So as people cut into their cantaloupe and ate a little bit at a time, they were continuously exposed to that listeria in the cantaloupe. So how do we keep our produce safe? So these are just some basic things that we can think about as we go through, making sure that we are using clean land and soil. So thinking about what has been on that soil before we even plant there. We want to make sure that we are minimizing human pathogens in the soil. So obviously, we don't want to plant anything over our drain field in our yard where we could have some human pathogens there. We want to make sure that we're following safe guidelines for manure use. None of this is required, but these are some good guidelines for us that are there, that are able for us to use, such as the specific waiting period if you do use raw manure. So if you have crops that don't touch the soil, such as, staked tomatoes, if you have corn, anything where there's that really low risk of the crop touching the soil, there's a 90-day waiting period from the time that you apply that raw manure until you can harvest it. If you have crops that do touch the soil, such as your carrots or turnips, anything in the ground, it's a 120-day waiting period from the time that you apply that manure until the time that you should harvest it. Of course, we don't think of, if we do use raw manure, the better thing to do is to apply in the fall, make sure that we do a really good job of exposing that manure to sunshine to try to help kill some of those pathogens. And of course, even better is to use properly composted compost. There are some pretty specific guidelines for composting. I tell people that if they do want to use compost, there's a pretty exact science that goes with it, that I encourage people to really do their research. It's not just as easy as going out and throwing your scraps into a pile in your backyard. There's a whole lot more that goes into it that we really want to make sure that we're careful about so that we are killing those pathogens that may be present, such as making sure that we're using the correct pile size, that we're really thinking about our carbon to nitrogen ratio in our compost, that we are keeping our temperature between 131 and 170 degrees. This is essential. The science shows that temperature is where what those pathogens need to be exposed to kill them. If you are using, for example, some people will throw on weeds onto their compost pile. It's also essential that we get those weed seeds that may be in our compost pile up to that degree level as well, because those seeds require some really high temperatures to kill them so that you're not reintroducing weeds back into your planting area. We want to make sure that we're using a thermometer and checking the temperature. If you're buying compost, you want to make sure that you are getting a log or a copy of the log, because people that are selling compost should also be following these guidelines and should have a log that they could give you that shows that they've also been doing this. We have a wonderful specialist at Virginia Tech. His name is Greg Ivanilo, and he is like the composting master. So he is wonderful. That website right there is a great resource on composting and what you can do. It's just that he has like a compost school that he puts on. There's all sorts of different documents and publications that are there to access on composting that I point people to if they think they want to get into composting and use their own compost as well. So water. Water is another really important one. If we are irrigating, which if we are growing in plastic, you know, irrigation is pretty essential. Thinking about what our water source is, where that water's coming from, whether or not it touches the produce, all of that we have to think through to help keep our produce safe. Well water is preferred to surface water because we know that surface water, such as a pond, so if you are pulling from a pond for irrigation, the likelihood of contaminants being introduced into that pond is much higher than if you're pulling water from a well for irrigation. So we want to make sure that we are doing a really good job of monitoring our water quality, making sure that if we're doing well water, that we're testing at least once a year. More than that is preferable. You know, 3 or 4 times a year is probably 4, maybe a little excessive, but making sure that we want to make sure that we have a good idea of exactly what's going on in our water while we're using it. So, you know, even if you did 2 well water samples, we want to make sure that we're pulling it during our really heavy use period. So, you know, if we are doing a lot of drip irrigation in July and August, we want to make sure that we are testing our water in July and August, not in December when we probably aren't using as much water. If we are doing anything using water post-harvest, so if we are washing our fruits and vegetables before we're selling them, that water must be tested, because that has to be potable water. It has to be water that is safe to drink. One great thing is that if you are near a VDAX lab anywhere across the state, we've actually worked out an agreement with them thanks to the produce safety rule and their water testing requirements, so that we can get our water tested for $20, which is incredibly not cheap, but very reasonable when it comes to water testing, so that we can get an idea of where we are looking at coliform bacteria and generic E. coli, because that's what we do have to think about for our water testing. If you must use surface water to irrigate, we want to make sure that we are really testing frequently and testing during those really high usage periods, and that we're testing after some sort, if we have a major weather event that may come through, we want to make sure that we're testing through that. Drip irrigation is always better than overhead irrigation, just because that drip irrigation does minimize some of the risk. When we think about overhead irrigation, that if we have contaminated water, we're just continuously covering our produce in that contamination. And like we talked about with those plant openings in the leaves, we can get some of that contamination in through those leaves inside our produce. Whereas drip irrigation, we think that should be going straight down to the roots to get it to where that plant really needs it. Of course, there are issues, which is why we need to still test, because if we do have, a break in our line somewhere where that drip irrigation water is going to get all over our produce, we have to think about that. That risk is still there, but drip irrigation does help us minimize some of that risk. Thinking about making sure that we are keeping pets, farm animals, and wild animals out of that surface water used for irrigation as best as we can. Geese are one thing that are a great spreader of germs and contaminants. And we also know that we cannot control all of the wild animals. So the best that we can do, if we think about fencing, if we can, if we're just doing our best effort to show that we are trying to keep some of these wild animals out of, or in our livestock, anything out of our ponds that we're going to irrigate our produce with. Thinking about animals and wildlife, thinking about working animals versus pets. And this is one that I know a lot of people have a really hard time with. And I'll be the first one to admit it. I have a dog that I love that is a farm dog that goes everywhere. And I think, everybody has that farm dog. But we do have to think about the working animals versus the pets. Are your pets trained to not defecate and to poop and pee in the field next to your produce? There are some working animals that are there to keep geese or birds or livestock out of the field, and you can train them to only use the bathroom out of those produce fields. So if we're thinking about minimizing risk, keeping our pets out of our produce fields is one big way to help mitigate some of that risk. Livestock allowed in produce fields. This is one that I also see a lot of. Thinking about, if you are opening up a new field. So we do have a lot of farms who go through and they'll put pigs on a field to help open it up, because those pigs do a great job of going in and rooting everything up and working that field up for you. So then we go back and have to think about that raw manure application. So as long as we are keeping that growing period long enough away from when that manure would have been deposited on the field, we can do that. One thing that I've seen that is an absolute not allowed is having chickens in your produce fields. If you are a small diversified farm and you're selling eggs and produce and everything, we've got to make sure that those chickens are never, ever, ever allowed in our produce fields while we have produce growing there. I was at a farm one time and, they had chickens running up and down and through their lettuce. And that is a huge, huge health risk, because we think that lettuce is ready to go. They're going to harvest it and sell it to the consumer very soon. And they've got chickens that are going to poop on next to, be a great source for contaminants on that lettuce right there. So we want to make sure that we're keeping our chickens or any sort of produce, birds, anything fenced away from our produce so they can't get in. Wild animal control, we've got to make sure that we're doing the best that we can. So it's going through, it's scouting for animals, it's making sure that we're keeping records of what we see when. So if we know that a big flock of geese flies over every October and lands in one of your fields, how do you do the best? What can you do to try to keep those geese out of your produce field? Just like deer. So we know that a herd of deer has a trail right through one of your fields. So do we try to fence it off to limit the access? Do we try to, what can we do to try to limit some of that risk that may be there? Worker health and hygiene. So this is important for you, and this is important if you have any employees. I know some farms, you are the only worker there. So this is still really, really important to remember. If you do have employees, we want to make sure that we're really training and emphasizing worker health and hygiene, because good personal hygiene in the field and post-harvest handling is essential. So we want to make sure that we are, wearing clean clothes. We're not wearing the same clothes 3 days in a row and harvesting every day, especially if we have a diversified farm where we're taking care of animals and produce, all throughout the day. No jewelry. Jewelry can both carry bacteria as well as be a potential physical contaminant should you lose a ring or a bracelet in your produce field. No eating, no drinking. We want to make sure that we have specified areas, break areas where people can go do their eating and drinking as they need to. And we also want to make sure that if there is smoking, that we do wash our hands after any smoking may happen. Tobacco mosaic virus is one big example that I like to use with this, because that's one, if you smoke, tobacco mosaic virus is one that can be spread to tomatoes. And if you have, smoke a cigarette and don't wash your hands and go back out and handle tomatoes, there is that possibility that you can give tobacco mosaic virus to your tomatoes. So hand washing is essential. We want to make sure that we're teaching people how and when to wash their hands. You think that it's simple, but sometimes having that sign right there next to the hand washing facilities can go a long way. And Virginia Tech, as well as the Virginia Department of Health, has some really great, just 8.5 by 11 signs that you can print out and laminate and have for people to see, just as that visual reminder on how to wash your hands. If you have sick workers, so the question, are there risks for the consumers from a produce farmer that smokes and handles produce? Not that I know of, as long as that farmer is doing a good job with that personal hygiene. So making sure that we are washing our hands after we're smoking. The biggest things that you would think about is if you have any bacteria on your hands, you smoke and then you touch, but that's not even just smoking. That's any sort of, if you touch your face and then handle produce, you still, could be transmitting bacteria onto the produce. So yes and no, not technically from those cigarettes, but just in general, that's where that good hand washing comes into play. Thinking about sick workers. So this is really hard if you are the only worker and you do come down with a stomach bug, what to do. So that's where we have to think through a plan B. So do you have anyone that can help you? Because if you're stuck in the bathroom for 3 days, we really should not be out handling any produce. But sometimes it's just, I understand those things have to get done, but we need to make sure that we are minimizing that risk. We want to make sure that if there are any, waiting for at least 24 hours that you're symptom free before you get out in the field handling produce. If we have jaundice, we're going to require a doctor's release, any sort of sore throat. So a cold, a sore throat, people want to come to work, but we want to make sure that if we do that, you can give them other on the farm jobs. So that may be, laying drip tape or laying plastic. But we want to make sure it's non-food handling, non-container handling duties. So not handling anything that's going to have that produce in it that's eventually going to go to that consumer. Hand washing facilities. They must be near the produce field where those employees are working. They must be well stocked. We want to make sure that we are using single-use towels, which is hard for some people who, see it as wasteful to use the paper towel every time. But if we are all using one towel to dry our hands on, then we're going to be spreading those germs from person to person. The paper towel is just the safer way to be able to wash our hands. And we really need to emphasize why hand washing is important, making sure that those people understand that it's our duty to keep those consumers safe. Toilet facilities, they need to be within a 1/4 mile or a 5-minute drive from the field. And we think about that because, you know, a lot of these foodborne illnesses can get spread by using the bathroom in the field and not washing our hands afterwards. So if those facilities are available, at least somewhat nearby, you know, it's not quite, oh my gosh, I have to walk a mile to go to the bathroom. Well, forget that. I'm going to go over in the trees over here and take care of my business. You know, we want to make sure that it's available and accessible to hopefully encourage people to really use those bathroom facilities. And, you know, it's our job, you know, making sure that we really do emphasize that not using the bathroom in the field is essential, that we have to use the toilet, and there's just no ifs, ands, or buts about that. Cleaning and sanitizing. So we want to make sure that we are washing and sanitizing all of our work surfaces, any packing bins, any utensils. So that's things that we're using to harvest in the field. Anything that we can wash and sanitize, we need to be washing and sanitizing. We can pressure wash it. You need to use a detergent. That detergent can vary depending on what it is that you're washing. And sanitizer, again, that can kind of vary how strong that sanitizer needs to be depending on the situation. And one thing that we really think about is that you cannot sanitize a dirty surface. We've got to remove that dirt off the surface before we are able to sanitize it. So the procedure for this is we want to rinse it, so that removes any sort of loose debris that we need to get off. Then we need to wash with our detergent, then we rinse again, and then we sanitize. So anything that's a food contact surface, we want 200 parts per million of chlorine. Anything not contacting food, that's a 400 parts per million of chlorine. And you can get chlorine test strips to be able to test your water to make sure that your sanitizing solution is at the rate that it needs to be. Just making sure that we're, again, practicing good hygiene can go a long way in the cleaning and sanitizing. We want to make sure that we're using that cleaned and sanitized equipment. And this is the next one. We label our plots and containers for traceability. This is one where record keeping just becomes essential. We want to make sure, you know, that we are just get a notebook and just write down just what you do every day. You know, that you harvested tomatoes from field X, or you planted peppers in field Y. That can go a long way in traceability. It can help you with your farming records in the future so that you know what you did year to year. But the worst case scenario, if there is, you know, if there ever were to be an outbreak that you would be associated with, they would want you to be able to trace everything that you grew on that farm. We want to try to wash our produce before entering the packing facility. So if you are, and some people, you know, they just harvest from the field and take it to the farmer's market and sell, which is, you know, fine, depending on what it is. Some people wash before they take to the farmer's market, which is great too, because you can get rid of some of the contaminants, but we've got to make sure that we are washing correctly when it comes to that post-harvest handling, that we are using different containers for the field and the market. So we don't want to use the same plastic bins in the field and then turn around and take them to the farmer's market. I know some people will maybe use two different plastic totes, or two different color plastic totes, of a black and a white, you know, something that is very visually different between the two, so that we know this only stays on the farm in the harvest area and this only stays in the packing area and goes to the farmer's market. We want to make sure that we are doing a good job of cleaning our storage areas. Dr. Laura Strawn over on the Eastern Shore does a lot of work with listeria. And basically, listeria is found anywhere where there's water. It's almost impossible to get rid of listeria, which means that if we have some sort of packing area, more than likely, if you test the water that's found on the wall, on the floor, anything like that, there is a chance that you will have listeria there. So we want to make sure that we are doing a good job of cleaning and sanitizing as best we can our storage areas. And we're keeping things, you know, clean so that we don't have rodent problems, so that we don't have a lot of dirt on the floor, or, you know, that we're just trying to keep things clean to keep our produce safe. We want to make sure that we're not reusing our produce containers. This is really hard if, you know, if you are using those green cardboard paper berry containers, or the plastic ones, or people may want to bring them back to you to reuse. If they want to do that, the best thing to do is that you put something, you refill berries from there. You never take that container back to your farm. If they are insistent that they want to use that one green container for their raspberries and strawberries, well, you just put more berries into that container for them. Make sure anything that you use at the farmer's market can be washed and sanitized. So if you do have a display that is very visually appealing, you're using lots of baskets and lots of cloths, and, you know, really making an inviting experience for people, we've got to make sure that that also can be washed and sanitized after every single farmer's market, because we don't want to, you know, take some sort of contaminant from the farmer's market back to our farm, because we don't know where those people have been before they came to our booth. They may have gone to Farmer Bobby, you know, 3 tenths down, and touched all of his tomatoes, and then came to you and could have brought E. coli with him. We just don't know. So that's why making sure that we can wash them is so important. Anything that produce touches needs to be able to be cleaned and sanitized, which is why we have to be really careful with wooden crates and wooden baskets if we're using those in our display. Wood is very hard to clean and sanitize. It's very visually appealing, but it's very hard to get it clean afterwards. We want to make sure that we're encouraging our customers to wash all of their produce before consuming it, no matter what. That is one of the biggest ways that we can reduce our contaminants before we get it to that customer. And we just, you know, a friend and I were actually having this conversation, is when you think about how many people just almost unconsciously pick up tomatoes or apples and feel them. And I do the exact same thing at the grocery store. You pick them up and feel them to feel how ripe they are, how firm they are, how soft they are. You know, think about how many people come through and touch those tomatoes before they finally go home to the final customer. And again, you could have done everything that you could on your end to keep things clean, and somebody could have brought in some sort of pathogen. So that's why we really want to encourage that people aren't just picking up strawberries out of that container and popping them in. Yeah, they're delicious, and yes, I've done it, but is that the best thing, you know, the best practice? No, we really want to wash them before we eat them. Produce handling. We want to make sure that we are monitoring our storage temperatures. And in the resources that I'll send out, there's some really great, excellent publications on, you know, temperatures and what temperature to store our produce at, and the relative humidity, etc. We want to make sure that we're removing that field heat as soon as possible, because that, you know, keeping that produce hot is going to decrease the quality. Getting it cool as soon as possible is going to help us with our safety and that produce quality, because getting those lower temperatures, getting that produce, that temperature down where it needs to be, is going to lower the growth rate of the microorganisms that may be present on our produce. That microorganism growth just grows exponentially between 60 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. So we want to make sure that we have, and that's where we have to think about our cold produce or storage or produce storage as well, getting good airflow through there, making sure that we're getting good cooling all around all of our produce. Most of the produce can be stored at 41 degrees Fahrenheit. We just have to think about any produce that may be susceptible to any chill injuries. This publication or this website right here that's listed is another great publication on produce, on handling produce. So why does this all matter? And I think this is important. You know, why? Why do I need to do this? Because anything, no matter how you grow it, whether you grow it organically, where you grow it conventionally, no matter where it comes from, you know, anything can be contaminated if it's not handled properly from the time, you know, that it's grown in the ground until it gets to that consumer. So thinking through what is next. So we have this information. Where do we go now? So the first thing we can start to think about is a food safety plan, which sounds really scary, but really there's some great resources to help you think through the flow of that produce on your farm. What happens where? How does your produce move on your farm, and where could possible contamination occur? So for example, we know that at 4 o'clock every afternoon we go out and feed the chickens, and then we go out to the field and harvest our tomatoes. So if we don't change our boots after we feed the chickens, perhaps we are taking some of those contaminants from the chickens into the produce field. So this is where your extension agents can be a really great resource for you to help you develop a food safety plan, to help you think through the flow on your farm and where possible contamination could occur. There's also the enhancing the safety of locally grown produce training. And that's what I pulled a bunch of these slides from. That training is absolutely great for people who are farmers market vendors who are just kind of starting to think about some fresh produce food safety, who aren't really sure where to start and just want some ideas on how to get going with making sure that everything is safe. There's some great Virginia Tech resources. There's a whole produce safety website that's been developed that has wonderful resources on all sorts of different things, produce safety-wise, for producers. So if you have any questions, I am certainly a resource. But if you look on this website right here that's linked, that includes all of the extension agents across the state who are involved in fresh produce food safety. And I would encourage you to reach out to any of them if you have questions to help answer those questions for you. Does anyone have any questions? This is all that I have.
Anybody with questions can use the chat box at the bottom of your screen, or just unmute yourself and ask the question. Thank you, Sarah. That was really informative and got me thinking about produce safety way more than I had before. Thank you so much.
Okay, so best way to clean a wicker basket, or okay if we line with a tea towel. So if you can kind of dip it in a solution every once in a while, a chlorine solution, that's the best way to dip it in and then let it dry in the sun if you can. If not, making sure that you do use a good tea towel that covers the whole basket and that you're washing that tea towel after every use.
Thank you, Sarah. This is Kim Hutchinson. Are there any more questions?
So, yep, so Cheryl, I keep a spray bottle of water, bleach mix, and spray baskets and let dry. Yep, that's acceptable too.
Any other questions? Well, Sarah, to reiterate what Mary said, this has been very informative. I will think gosh, I'm thinking entirely differently now about all my fruits and vegetables and what I would do as a consumer when I get them all home too. I know you've given all of the farmers and the market managers a lot to think about on the call today. It's been so informative and so important, the information that you've shared. I so appreciate all of the help and support that you and Rachel and the Extension have given us over the course of this project. And I thank you so much for all of your continued support of Virginia's farmers markets.
Absolutely.
Mary, thank you. Mary, did you have anything else that you wanted to add?
Just that, as usual, I'll be sending out an email tomorrow with a link to this webinar in case you want to watch it again, along with the resources that Sarah provides and a feedback form, just so she can have input on future sessions that she creates. But that's
yes,
it.
Mary and I are, that's great. Mary and I are in the process of putting together our next round of sessions, so please feel free to send us the topics that you're interested in. And in the meantime, we hope to see you all at the conference in November. Sarah, thank you, and thank Rachel and all of the work and support of the Extension for all that you do. We greatly appreciate it. Until we talk again, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.